Hello friends, this is going to be a video detailing the events of the Szarr Massacre. It's going to be talking about stuff that we can find in-game, from the Dungeons & Dragons campaigns themselves, and from the wikis such as the Forgotten Realms wiki and the Baldur's Gate wiki. I do want to take a moment and apologize for it taking so long for me to get this video out. I promise this one is going to be significantly shorter than what I talked about with Amanita Szarr a few months ago. Truth be told, there isn't a ton of information about this, so please take everything I say with a grain of salt unless I just straight up tell you that it is canonical confirmed. So, first and foremost, where did this massacre take place? I know a lot of you are going to be like, there was a massacre? Because this is honestly something, whenever I've talked about it in the past, I get people who had no idea that this was even a thing, and I don't blame you because it's not something that's mentioned in the game. We actually find out about the massacre primarily in the campaign book Descent into Avernus. It is also mentioned in the small campaign Murder in Baldur's Gate. I don't remember the exact page for that, but I do put my citations at the end of this video. So, the massacre. Okay, so backstory, the Szarrs were a merchant family. Not all of the Szarrs were vampires. I feel like that's a really big thing that we need to look at here. Some of them were. In fact, I would say that a decent amount were, considering there is a line of dialogue in the game where if Astarion brings up the Szarr family, Gale knows that they were considered, quote, nasty creatures, because he knows who Cazador is. He seems to know that Cazador is a vampire, a very cruel one at that. So I think that they're definitely well known enough to have the lore passed down from time to time. But by all means, they were not all vampires, even if a large majority were. So the massacre is an event that had to take place prior to Cazador turning Astarion. And I'll tell you why in a bit, but it had to take place prior to that. Astarion had to have been turned in like sometime in the 1200s, most likely the late 1200s, considering Baldur's Gate takes place in 1492, I believe. So it had to take place around there. They were unknown rivals of the family. It does not say, it just said that they were rivals. Again, merchant families, people are fighting a lot. They're fighting, they're trying to get, maybe be like the better merchants. So they raid the castle in the middle of the night and they killed the entire family. It was, again, likely due to politics, monetary reasons. This castle was located in what is called Tumbledown, which is in Baldur's Gate for the record, but we do not see that in the game, so it's likely, when I looked on a map of like where Tumbledown is compared to where Baldur's Gate is, it's likely to me that they just did away with Tumbledown in the actual game, but it was a subsection of Baldur's Gate. They actually raided the entire estate. It was just left to be ruined. They burnt it down to the ground due to arson. Actually, I believe it stated that it was someone else burnt it to the ground. It was an arson that was done later on. I don't know if the two events were actually connected, but I will say that that's actually a really interesting factoid because there is an ending of Baldur's Gate, albeit rare, and obviously spoilers for the game, but there is an ending where Astarion will say that he actually burned Cazador's palace to the ground, which I immediately connected to this event. Whether that was intentional or not, who knows, but I thought it was fascinating all the same. The palace, located in Tumbledown, was also located near the Cliffside Cemetery, and all the family crypts were there. Around 1482, 10 years before the events of the game, the Gravemaker organization was actually said to have lived into the ruin, like moved in, lived in the ruins of the palace to protect the graves. So the Gravemakers weren't bad people by any means. They were just, protecting the graves and everything. So they moved into the ruins of the palace. That being said, knowing that lore, which is said to us in, I believe it's Descent into Avernus, but that is a canonical fact that the Gravemakers lived in the ruins. The palace mentioned here has to be different than Szarr Palace. There are too many overlaps and plot twists if they aren't the same. So by all means, I refer to them as two separate entities, because that's the only way it actually fits into the lore at all. So kind of bouncing off of what I just was saying on the last slide, we have a few known places that the Szarrs have lived. Tumbledown, of course. It was part of the outer city of Baldur's Gate. The mansion was located bordering Cliffside Cemetery. The way they describe the palace here sounds so similar to how they describe Szarr Palace in the actual game, but again, just canonically they have to be two separate places. Now, I completely believe that it's possible that when they wrote the game, they could have absolutely messed up and just overlooked plot holes. It's happened before. Wouldn't surprise me. But it does make perfect sense to me that they could just be two different locations because they kind of have to be, because Cazador would have basically been rising to the challenge as a new vampire lord and had to have built a palace from scratch, which he could have done, but I do find it really unlikely, so I will always refer to them as two separate places unless proven otherwise. Yes, the massacre did take place in the original palace, which is really tragic if you think about it because it was the whole family. It's heavily implied that, people of all ages lived there. Not all of them were vampires, of course. So to know that these people, were just actually living their lives, it's not that the Szarrs were necessarily cruel people by default, and all of them were killed, which is awful. Fun fact, murder in Baldur's Gate is not about the murder in the Szarr Palace. It's just kind of offhandedly mentioned, and it doesn't really reinstate any new lore that Descent into Avernus states, but it is an interesting read anyway. I would kill for a physical copy of Murder in Baldur's Gate, but they are very hard to find, so I only was able to reference a digital edition from a friend. Angeveld, I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. There was a family estate there because Incognitas are used to live there. Incognitas are also mentions old family servants, because she's like, that's where I grew up, these are who raised me. I personally believe that these servants were either compelled by vampires or just actually too scared to say anything, because they don't actually go looking for Amanita when she's turned. Which, I'm not getting into Amanita again, I have a whole video on her. But I do think that even after this tragedy took place, with how little they had, the Szarrs still maintained a really big grip on the city and their estates surrounding it. We have so much to infer that they had such a really strong reach on people. I mean, Gortash had a lot of the city politicians under his thumb. A lot of the nobles seemed to turn up his nose at them. Turn up their nose at him. They didn't really seem to care. In fact, nope, getting my words mixed up. Cazador specifically says he's worried about Gortash's rule because he's like, oh, well, this might make my operations more difficult. Because clearly Gortash was not in on the whole thing like some of the other politicians had been, which is a whole other thing to unpack. But now Cazador himself grew up in the Western Heartlands. You can find this out on the Forgotten Realms wiki. It was a diverse part of Faerun. You can discover this through the description on his dagger. So the Rhapsody dagger, if you inspect it, you'll briefly talk about in his homelands. There's actually the description of the Rhapsody is really disturbing. I won't repeat it here, but I would caution yourself that it is potentially triggering. So if you choose to go look at that description, please take care of yourself when you do. Interestingly enough, though, the Western Heartlands, it's described on the wiki as having, quote, a warlock's crypt, which is usually crawling with ghosts, wraiths, and vampires. Is that intentional? Is it not? I don't know, but I do think it's interesting to me anyway that some of these places that, the one place where Cazador himself grew up, wasn't a place that had this area that was just, quote, crawling with these supernatural entities. So they have been around Faerun, definitely. But Baldur's Gate seems to be where they have settled in, with the exception of, like, they had an estate elsewhere, which their estate doesn't necessarily have to do with their vampirism. They were a merchant family, they were wealthy. It makes sense for them to have estates elsewhere. It seems like, to me anyway, that the vampirism was just kind of like this extra thing that kind of helped with their reach. So we know that the family was murdered, well, most of them anyway. We know a little bit about where they've lived. So what became of them afterwards? And if I haven't made it clear, I am going to actually reference what I talked about a couple slides ago. Yes, the massacre did have to take place before Cazador turning Astarion. And I say this because Cazador was a full-fledged vampire at the time he turned Astarion. It doesn't seem like he was a full-fledged vampire when this massacre happened. Don Elazar, who was the prior vampire head before Velioth, it does not seem to me that she was killed in the massacre either. It seems very much like Velioth killed her and then took on Cazador as his spawn. Well, I say spawn loosely because obviously at some point Cazador became a full-fledged vampire under Velioth's rule. How that was done, we actually don't know, but one way or another, it happened. So I definitely believe that this massacre had to be said and done far before Astarion was ever turned, because it doesn't seem like something that Cazador was too concerned with. Likely because it happened when he was still growing up, perhaps before he was turned, but I will not speak on that because there's a very good chance he was turned, and perhaps that's why he's alive. Perhaps that's why he's alive, because there are very few living Szarr left, which actually makes sense because I talk here, Cazador is the patriarch of the family. So he definitely, assumed this role after killing Velioth. I am not saying Velioth is a Szarr. In fact, I do not believe Velioth is a member of the Szarr family. Whether I think Donella had just taken Velioth on from a different family or as an outsider, and then Velioth continued with a cycle of Szarrs, which does make sense because the Szarrs seem very bent on kind of like making their family seem better. Hence, Amanita isn't killed, she's just turned into a vampire. Even though it's against her will, she's turned into a vampire, so it seems like they definitely want this kind of like line to continue. Perhaps this is just speculation. Perhaps the Szarrs found their family to be weak. They were killed in this massacre. They didn't have they weren't able to stop themselves. They didn't really have a say in the matter, of course. They were all slaughtered. But personally, I kind of wonder if some of the Szarrs were like, oh, well, they were just weak, and now we're vampires, so we're not going to be weak. That's how I see it. That is fully how I think it went down, but that is also fully speculation, so take that with a grain of salt. Also, this is definitely sexism, and I'm not saying that it's okay, but Cazador Szarr is the patriarch of the household, so he is the masculine head of house. It makes sense because he was pretty much one of the only mask members left to be head of house. Not saying that there wouldn't have been a chance that a matriarch couldn't have existed, considering Donna Lazar previously did hold a place of command. It just seems to me now, though, that for whatever reason they were defaulting to a masculine head of house, which, it's Baldur's Gate, it's also the 1400s. Whether or not sexism exists, you can decide that on your own, but one way or another, he is the patriarch, so he is the masculine head of house. And also, I am not just using the word patriarch. Gale says it in the game. It is just actually confirmed. Amanita Szarr, when she was turned, it said that everyone in that room that she was with, when she was turned, are the only living Szarrs, which means all the Szarrs that remain are vampires, now including herself. Hence why I don't believe Amanita is a spawn. I fully think she's a traditional vampire. So as of 1477, the only living Szarr were Cazador, Fistula, Dralia, and Amanita. 5 total. Amanita is the youngest. Oh, and Blovard as well. But as I say here, Blovard I do assume to be male actually. But Castro still has superiority over him. Age, status, he's been around longer. By all means, I don't know that all of the vampire had as harsh of a rate, as harsh of an upbringing. Don't quote me on that. I could be entirely wrong. Amanita clearly does have a harsh upbringing, but it also doesn't seem like they focus on tormenting her in such a personal way as maybe Cazador tortured his other spawn, and as Velioth tortured Cazador. I also believe that's probably because she's related. So they're like, oh, well, we're gonna do this to you, but see, it's not that bad. Which is classic manipulative abuser behavior. But by all means, I don't believe that Amanita was necessarily in the same category that we had with Velioth and Cazador. I feel like there was a lot more cruelty used there. Again, likely because they were not blood family the same way that Amanita and Cazador is, which doesn't make it any better. And I want to be very clear, I'm not justifying anything that was done. It just seems to me like they're using status and family as an excuse for everything. So they're like, oh, well, we only did this bad thing to you. We didn't do these other bad things to you because you're family. Which kind of goes to show you how upsetting the dynamic is for the Szarrs. Amanita's parents are assumed to be no, I mean they're said to be dead, and they're said to be dead because she said that she's raised by servants. Her parents are not any of the people that were listed above, so they therefore have to be dead. It's unknown if they died in the massacre, although personally I don't believe they did. It seems to me that they were killed in some other way. If I really want to read into it, I fully believe that her family had them killed. It seems to me, again, all speculation, that maybe her family didn't want her to be raised in the cruelty of the Szarrs, where they're like, oh, well, we're family, so we're going to torment each other. That's how I see it. It's not canonical, but I do not believe that she was killed, that her mother or her father were killed in the massacre. The timeline just does not add up. It's actually said that the ghosts of the murdered family still haunt the graveyard and the ruins of the palace. Some people say that the ghosts and the graveyard. Some people say that the ghosts and the grave makers get along because the grave makers are protecting the crypts of the murdered individuals. However, some people say that they do prey on the grave makers, so it's kind of hit or miss. Like, quite literally, when I say some people, I mean like the Dungeons and Dragons books say that the reports from civilians are conflicting. They do say that ghosts kidnap and murder folks from the city, which I just find a little bit interesting because what is the one thing Cazador is making his spawn do? Abduct people. And I know that they're luring them back, but it's still abduction by a mission. So I do find it interesting that these murdered Szarrs are kidnapping people, yet their ghosts are kidnapping and murdering people, and then Cazador's making his spawn do something kind of similar, different motives, but still, I found that a little bit fascinating. So as of the time of the game, the family really is just Cazador, these other living quote-unquote vampire relatives that we do not see, and then Amanita Szarr, who again we do not see in the game. So we don't know if by killing Cazador in the game, if we clear out the Szarr line entirely. I personally would find it unlikely because these other relatives probably are out there somewhere, but at the very least, I believe Amanita would still be out there somewhere. But we do take care of the patriarch of the household, so I think it's safe to say that we do, in the course of the game, cripple the family, probably to a point of no return. I mean, there's no other living Szarrs. They can't procreate and have, true vampires, yes, they can procreate, but at the same time, I don't think that's like something that's gonna happen when most of them seem decently old. I mean, like it's Cazador's aunt. It's and I mean the only adults here are Cazador's aunt and possibly his mother. We're unsure of the family relation, but they seem much older. Does not seem like that's something that's gonna happen. We don't actually know how old Blowvard is at all, so I'm not even gonna try with that. So it seems like we have crippled the family line if you kill Cazador in the game. Therefore, I think it's safe to say that we pretty much cleared them out. And that is it for me. Again, this was slightly shorter. I yapped a lot on the last slide. These are the citations to fact check, so I used the Szarr family from the Forgotten Realms wiki, Dungeons & Dragons campaign book, Descent to Avernus, page 196 specifically, Dungeons & Dragons campaign book, Murder in Baldur's Gate. Unfortunately, I don't know the exact page, but I feel like it might have been in the 90s. Don't quote me on that. The Cazador Szarr Baldur's Gate wiki and Forgotten Realms wiki page, Amanita Szarr's Baldur's Gate 3 wiki page, the Western Heartlands Forgotten Realms wiki, and then of course my own research from in-game notes and just general observations. Keep in mind whenever I'm giving an observation, it is not to be canon. The only things that are canon are the general facts that I listed about like the murder, the family that's still alive. That is all canonical, confirmed in the game, and the massacre itself is an event that happened. Thank you all so much for sticking with me, and if you like this video, subscribe and also check out my Twitter. Thank you so much. Bye bye.